former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been fighting for his political career, one that has taken a beating over his statements to Parliament on COVID-19 lockdown parties at number 10 Downing Street. Johnson has repeatedly insisted that he did not intentionally mislead Parliament over the Partygate scandal. Opening the crunch hearing by a House of Commons committee, the ex-Conservative leader swore an oath on the Bible and declared that, hand on heart, he did not lie to the House.
I'm here to say to you, hand on heart, that I did not lie to the House. When those statements were made, they were made in good faith and on the basis of what I honestly knew and believed at the time.
Parliament's Committee of Privileges is investigating whether Johnson, who was ousted from Downing Street in September, intentionally or recklessly misled the House of Commons in a series of statements about the parties. It is also assessing if the breaches are serious enough to warrant sanctioning Johnson for contempt of Parliament. Earlier this month, the panel stated that evidence suggests he misled Parliament about knowledge of lockdown-breaking parties at his Downing Street office. The Committee of Privileges said Johnson may have misled the House of Commons on at least 4 occasions. Now, if the committee finds that Johnson misled the lawmakers, then he could be suspended. Any suspension longer than 10 days could prompt an election to remove him from his parliamentary seat. During the 3-hour session, Johnson said that it would have been utterly insane to lie about the gatherings at 10 Downing Street.
To see you all, and I think, thank you by the way. I understand public anger, and I continue to apologise for what happened on my watch, and I take full responsibility. But as you've just said, Chair, the purpose of this inquiry is not to reopen so-called Partygate. It is to discover whether or not I lied to Parliament, wittingly misled colleagues and the country about what I knew and believed about those gatherings when I said that the rules and the guidance had been followed at number 10.
The so-called Partygate scandal contributed to the ultimate downfall of Johnson after months of reports claimed that he, alongside other senior government figures, had conducted in alcohol-fuelled gatherings, many of them in fact in 10 Downing Street, during 2020 and 2021, at the time when the rest of Britain was forced to stay at home. Well, for more on this, we're joined by Adam Schwartz, writer and political commentator, joining us from London. Adam, many thanks for your time this morning. A bullish defence by Boris Johnson yesterday. What did you make of it, and where do you see things progressing from here?
Well, I think even for the period of the last year, when we've seen 3 different prime ministers, this was a hugely dramatic moment of political theatre where we saw a former prime minister being presented in person with accusations that he misled Parliament, but also quite graphic evidence of that as well. I think Boris Johnson did an okay job at trying to stick to what appeared to be pre-prepared lines from his lawyer. But I think the reality is that for both the Privileges Committee and for the Court of Public Opinion, his defences will simply not be good enough. There were about 3.5 hours of questions and answers, but really they focused on 2 major issues. Firstly, they focused on whether Boris Johnson genuinely thought that the events that he himself attended that were in question were keeping within the rules and the guidance. And I think that it's very hard for Boris Johnson to argue this particular issue because the photographs that we saw of boozy drinks parties with no social distancing whatsoever contrasted so much with what both Boris Johnson was saying to the public on a daily basis, but also the lived experiences of sort of millions of people around the country. But Johnson argued essentially that these were, quote, essential work meetings. Now, I think for most people, they would consider essential work meetings to be work of which which an organisation could not continue to run without it being conducted. But clearly from these photographs, there was none of this kind of behaviour being conducted. I think that the second issue that they really focused on was whether Johnson diligently enough checked with people who were involved in some of these gatherings about whether the rules and the guidance were followed, the gatherings of which he didn't attend himself. Now, the committee really importantly found out there were in fact only 2 people that actually expressly told him that they were keeping within the guidance, and both of them were paid political party appointees from Johnson who were specifically in roles designed to support his sort of media and communications appearances. So clearly they were people who are not authorities on these kinds of issues, on this topic of law. So I think that was a really crucial part of it. And I think the combination of Johnson not being able to refute both of those puts him in a very difficult position. And I think the fact that Boris Johnson actually sort of lost his temper on that second point towards the end of the hearing really indicates that Johnson himself knows that he actually faces a very difficult time from being completely cleared by the committee. And I think overall, what Johnson is trying to do is try to sort of create a narrative of himself being unfairly removed by the system, trying to sort of cultivate this idea of the cult of Boris Johnson to try to improve his prospects of his stature for sort of his post-premiership life. But ultimately, I think it's most likely that the committee will find him, guilty of some kind of deliberately or recklessly misleading the House of Parliament. And of course, whatever sanction they suggest will go on to the wider House of Commons to vote on that sanction.
So regardless of which way this goes, Adam, do you assess that this is really the end of Boris Johnson's career, certainly as a frontline politician?
I think in the short term, I think it's overwhelmingly likely that Boris Johnson's frontline career is over. I mean, as you mentioned, if he has a suspension of more than 10 days in the House, that will automatically trigger a recall by-election of which he could be removed from his seat. But I do think it's worth remembering that just as recent as last October, there were still 100 Conservative MPs who actually wanted him back as leader of the Conservative Party, and I think quite a lot of them actually view Boris Johnson as a potential post-election leader of the Conservative Party, when he might be able to return to his place as the leader of the Conservative Party in a sort of different role as leader of the opposition. But I think really, the major test, if Boris Johnson survives as an MP throughout this crisis, will, actually be, to what extent does he still have support within the Parliamentary Conservative Party? And we'll get quite a good indication from that when we actually have the vote by, Parliament themselves after the committee, or if the committee refers Boris Johnson to face some kind of sanction from the committee. So I think that'll be quite revealing. But I do think there's also another aspect in mind, and that is Boris Johnson yesterday was leading a rebellion on the so-called Windsor Framework, which is the latest edition of the Northern Ireland deal with the EU. And he only managed to convince about 21 of his colleagues in Parliament to actually join him. Now, that's a very, very small number, which actually I think reflects dwindling influence that Boris Johnson has over the Conservative Party, and I think actually was very much a sort of humiliation for him. So I think in all likelihood, I think Boris Johnson's political career is certainly coming towards an end.
Adam Schwartz, many thanks there for your insight, a writer and political commentator based in London.
Good to be with you.